Welcome, and thank you all very much for joining us today. My name is Hielke Koers. I'm the Chief Information Officer for STM Solutions, and I also serve as the Program Director for Seamless Access, both of which are organizations that take a keen interest in the topic of today, which is about FedCM, an update on the efforts between the R&E community and browser vendors. Before I hand over to Heather as the presenter today, a few items of housekeeping that I wanted to make sure everybody is aware of. Firstly, you're welcome to put your camera on, but feel free to turn it off as well. We are recording this session, so by all means, feel free to put the camera off if you prefer. We have ample time for Q&A and discussions at the end. If you do have questions during the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat, and Heather can either pick them up as she is speaking or we'll address them at the end. And the last bit of housekeeping is that this is just a general Zoom meeting. So if you are not speaking, please make sure to mute yourself so that we don't have background noise. With that out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker today, Heather Flanagan. Many of you will know her as the wearer of all the hats. In brief, Heather is the principal consultant and owner at Spherical Cow Consulting. And some of the other hats that she is wearing, she's an editor for ID Pro, a member of Refeds. She also does contract work at Google as a community facilitator. And I think many of us know Heather also in her capacity as program director for Seamless Access, which she has done brilliantly for a couple of years. But above all, I think the hat that trumps them all, if you like, is her abilities to translate from geek to human. And I certainly look forward to making use of that capability and her expertise as the geek to human translator in today's presentation. So with that, Heather, over to you.
Thank you, Hielke. All right, let's get this party started. Looks like there's about 40 of you on. I hope this will be useful information to you. But as Hielke said, if you've got any questions, drop them in the chat, and I'm happy to answer what I can. So what we're going to talk about today is, all right, well, what problem are the browser vendors in particular trying to solve that's brought us to the state where we are? Then I want to talk to you about tracking. So we know that this is all about trying to prevent tracking, but what is it? How is it done? So let's get a little bit more familiar with that. I want to talk about the timing of changes when they're coming, because that's usually what senior management wants to know more than anything else is, tell me when and tell me what I have to do. I'm going to report out as to a hackathon event that some of the research and engineering community had several weeks ago to try and help the development of the projects we're talking about going on forward. And then I'm going to talk about some next steps. So what is the problem that they're trying to solve? They're trying to solve the fact that people can be tracked on the web without their knowledge. Thanks to GDPR, go Europe. This is a very, very big deal for browser vendors. I mean, on the one hand, they can say, they're trying to do the right thing. And on the other hand, there's the stick of they're going to get heavy fines and in significant trouble if they don't. So they have to do something to prevent non-transparent, uncontrollable tracking. They have no choice. Well, that's like motherhood and apple pie and great, but it has a corollary for those organizations that actually use federated authentication, because many of the applications and services out there that do SSO, that do federated login, use exactly the same techniques, the same browser primitives as trackers. And so from the browser's perspective, they can't tell the difference. If they block one, then they're blocking our use case, which is quite valid, but they cannot technically tell the difference between the two. Our use case, of course, is very important. Academia, enterprise, in many cases, are actually not far off in terms of the level of difficulty that some of these changes are presenting. But a thing to keep in mind is that the biggest use case out there, you can take all the other use cases and combine them and say, how big an impact are they? They're not as big as the consumer web, the social media of the world, the casual use of the web, the e-commerce. That is the lead driver and what the browser vendors are primarily experienced in. That's what they know. So one thing to think about is, if you can take as many advantage of as many consumer web features as you can, that's one way to sort of future-proof yourself in terms of being more in alignment with what the browsers are doing. But regardless, the browser vendors don't know our space very well. They know the consumer web. Now, I am very focused on federation, federated authentication, those kinds of things, but it's worth making a mention that sites use features, cookies, the link decoration. They use that for a lot more than just authentication and authorization. The learning management systems use them to store user preferences or session information across the different frames. Some content discovery tools do the same thing, right? While I'm focused on federation, this still has broader impact than just our world. So let's talk about tracking. What is it? How is it done? Why do you care? Well, tracking happens in actually a variety of ways. Through third-party cookies is a big one. IP addresses is another. Browser fingerprinting, link decoration, and bounce tracking or redirects. So what's a cookie? Back in the day, when they first put this together, they named them cookies, so internet lore goes, after fortune cookies, because there were these little bits of thing that had information hidden in them. First-party cookies are set by a domain, and only the domain that created it can see it. So if nature.com sets a nature.com cookie for nature.com to see, that's fine. No one has any problem with that. That's not going to change. However, there are third-party cookies, and these are set by a domain, and any site can then read it. Now, if you are from a publisher that happens to have more than one domain name, possibly dozens or even hundreds of domain names, you probably use third-party cookies so that you can share certain types of information across all the domains you have. Those are absolutely what's under threat. IP addresses. Now, I know our community adores IP address authorization. It is so easy. It's such a simple user experience. If you're at the right IP address, then everything just works. There's no extra buttons, clicks, anything. Well, IP addresses are set to identify machines or services, and therefore they're actually high on the list of one of the pieces of information that trackers use to figure out, where is the user going across the web. All major browser vendors are starting to do things like building in browser-based VPN services that block IP addresses. So this is something that while we as a community are very dependent on, I can absolutely see it starting to break a little bit more and more and more over time. So changes will have to be made. Browser fingerprinting. IP addresses are also a component of this. And this is where, any one browser can actually be identified based on the information about the browser itself. There are various sites you can go to if you want to see how unique is your browser based on what plugins you have, what add-ons you have, what security features you've configured, all of those things. I know for a fact my browsers are highly identifiable as unique to me. And that is another way for advertisers in particular to start figuring out where a person is going from site to site. Link decoration. This one is particularly important to technologists of the world. I know you've all seen this, because this is when you have your URL, and then there's usually like a question mark and then something afterwards. Sometimes it's like UTM equals method email, saying the person clicked on this because they got an email and said that they could. It's used for query strings. It's also used for certain authentication tokens. And that UTM equals method, that's tracking information. I've dropped a link in here, and yes, the slides will be available. That just gives you an example of how the browser vendors are starting, in some cases, to do something about this. Bounce tracking. So this was a feature I don't know how many of you have ever had the dubious joy of managing like an email system. I started managing email systems back in 1996, and spam fighting has been going on since before I was doing that. What happens is, of course, is the good guys, the white hats, create something new. They create a block list, and then the spammers figure out a way around that. And then white hats have to invent something else, and then the spammers figure out a way around that. And it's just a constant battle of one-upping each other to try and address preventing spam. Well, bounce tracking was one of those items that they said, all right, some browser vendors have said you can't actually set a cookie or give information to a page that the user has not gone to. Okay, no problem. Let's set something like a pixel on the page that the user has to load. And having loaded it, look, they've gone to that website. It's perfectly valid. We're not a third party anymore. Very unfortunate, very effective in many cases. But this kind of bounce tracking, bouncing between sites and whatnot, is also used by SAML. It's also used by OpenID Connect. It certainly does get around the third-party limitations, but it is unfortunate. And there's another example of a browser that is trying to address bounce tracking specifically. Okay. That's all great. That's how tracking happens. Well, what does that mean for academia, for research and education? Well, first, I want to take a quick moment to make sure that you all recognize the difference between browsers and browser engines. This is an important distinction anytime you actually have to troubleshoot for a user, because if the user comes to you and says, Firefox isn't working for me, that's not enough information for you to actually determine the problem. You have to understand what operating system are they running on, because the operating system sets what engine the browser is working from. So Chrome normally is built on an engine called Blink, which you might know as Chromium. Firefox is built on one called Gecko. Safari is built on WebKit. And it's the browser engine that sets the basic functionality that is possible for any given browser. For iOS and iPadOS devices, the only browser engine that's been allowed to date is WebKit. So it doesn't matter if you're using Firefox or Chrome or something on iPad, you're using WebKit. And so you're going to find many of the same limitations that Safari has in those other browsers, simply because that's all it can do. Now, I do seem to recall that there's some activity in Europe right now where the European Commission thinks that that's bad business practice, and that they're trying to force Apple to allow other browser engines. But I mean, that's like happening right now. That debate is going on, and I don't think they've gotten past that point. At least for today, this is something that you need to be aware of. Okay, some quick what do you need to actually remember? What is really important for you to know right now? First, the authentication that uses SAML are SAML federations. So the Open Athens work of the world, the Shibboleth of the world, that's going to continue to work as designed for at least the next 1 to 3 years, with the exception of the ability to globally log out of all SAML sessions. Most people will tell you nobody can implement global log out of all SAML sessions anyway. It's never entirely worked. So this is not great, but it's also not hugely impactful for the majority of use cases. Okay, where are you from? Identity provider discovery services will continue to work. You will still be able to find what IDP that the user will be able to find them in order to figure out what to log into. But any storage of information about what IDPs they have gone to in the past probably won't work. The previous organizations are likely going to be forgotten, which is a feature of seamless access. And I know that they're working on ways around this. Any services that share information between third parties in frames, for example, Teams or learning management systems, will have very mixed results. If you use Teams through the browser, you'll find that Teams does not work on Safari. It hasn't worked on Safari in years. And if you go to Microsoft and say, hey, this isn't working on Safari, their answer is, well, then don't use Safari. It's not something they can fix. It's a fundamental disagreement about the nature of privacy between the two giants. And so it just doesn't work. Okay, next part, the other features that enable tracking. So the lowest hanging fruit right now that they've been trying to address urgently is third-party cookies. But those other features that can enable tracking are also under threat, and in some cases are already breaking, depending on which browser and which browser engine is being used. Now, wafeless linking, which is another big thing for our community, may be affected when they start coming after link decoration, but a lot of that depends on exactly how is it being implemented. So this is a very gray area. I would not be surprised if it starts breaking sooner rather than later, and that it starts breaking intermittently at different rates for different browsers. But I can't give you a prediction as to when to start panicking. So when is all of this happening? When do you have to worry? Well, kind of you had to start worrying about 5 years ago. Apple started to do a lot of their work and started blocking third-party cookies by default in 2017 as part of their intelligent tracking protection program. Mozilla, well, both Apple and Mozilla in this case don't actually tell you what their timelines are. They don't publish those. You sort of find out almost in the moment of when they're happening. But you can see that even Mozilla has gotten into this by turning on something called total cookie protection by default in June of last year. Google, for all the times that we poke at Google, they do at least have a timeline published. That timeline changes on a regular basis, but by golly, it is published. And when it comes to the third-party cookies, those are being phased out in the second half of 2024. But you'll start seeing more actions as they tighten and tighten and tighten incrementally what isn't possible in their browsers by default. Okay, so now let's talk about, there was this hackathon thing. What's a hackathon? A hackathon is a meeting where basically developers sit in a room, look at code architecture, and really start diving into it and say, okay, how can we actually address the code at the concepts at the level of code, given what we're trying to do. And this was the group that met in Mountain View at the very end of February. So our purpose for doing this was, I've been working on the federated identity community group efforts, which include the FedCM API, for 2 years, possibly 3 years. I might be losing count. And one of the things I can tell you absolutely is that the developers at Google, who are really driving a lot of this work, respond much better to proposals. If you come to them and say, well, I can look at what you've written and that's just not going to work, they will say, thank you very much, that was not helpful. They want to hear that's not going to work. Have you considered trying the following? So that was what we wanted to do. We wanted to get in the room and take a very active attempt at saying, can we create new proposals that add on to what you're doing, that will help solve the problem of tracking while preserving federation in a way that we all can live with. That was what we wanted to do for them. In turn, we wanted them to help us understand a little bit better the FedCM API itself and what were they thinking. And I don't mean that in a bad way, in the, what were you thinking? No, it was like literally, what were you thinking when you put into this, so that we can understand your constraints a little bit better. And then we wanted to make sure that they understood at least a little more what Research and Education Federation looks like, because it doesn't look like anything in the commercial web. All right, I've mentioned FedCM a couple times, and so I'm sure several of you are going, wait, what is that? What is that thing? Okay, it's a proposed browser JavaScript API. It is out there, it is open source, it is constantly under development. Google regularly releases an alpha version of their browser. It's called Canary, and Canary changes every day. It rebuilds every day. And that's where the FedCM is currently doing a lot of its iteration, is it gets added to the Canary every single day so that they can test and see how does it look, what does it look like. What it's supposed to do is help the browser know whether the user agreed for any information to be transferred between the service provider or the relying party, depending on what protocol you're talking about, and the identity provider. Wait, wrong way. So why does that matter? Because, well, let me step back for just a second. Unfortunately for the user, everybody that's currently involved in an authentication flow needs to be able to say, no, the user really did agree to this. They really did, because everybody's being held liable in some way, shape, or form. Did you do what you needed to do to protect the user's privacy? And so the identity provider has to have a certain level of consent. Did your users actually agree to this? The service providers absolutely need to be able to say, no, the user did agree that to give me information to use the site that they were going to do, provide at least their email address, something. The browsers, in having to do something to mitigate tracking, are also starting to get into the consent business, so that they also can say, no, we asked, we made triple sure that the user is being protected. The poor user is now being pummeled with, are you sure? No, are you really sure? Really? Are you really, really sure? Because everybody's asking them, because everybody needs to own a certain amount of consent. It's kind of unfortunate, but it's almost the way the laws have been designed. So why does FedCM in particular matter to us, perhaps more than some of the other efforts? Well, for one thing, it's the farthest along in development in the areas that we care about. And once the other browser vendors are comfortable with how FedCM works, in terms of does it meet its intended goals, then they will incorporate that API into their browsers, and they're going to feel a lot more comfortable saying, okay, we can start turning things off now because we have FedCM and sites are supposed to actually implement it and do something with it, and that's perfectly okay. And once the browser vendors, of course, are at that point, the organizations that actually work on federated technologies, the Shibboleth developers, the Simple SAML PHP developers, the Ping developers, it's going to be up to them to figure out how to work with this particular API or find completely different ways to do things, because services will be disrupted. So when jumping back to the hackathon a little bit, we came up with two separate proposals. One is creating a storage API, which required, as we put it at the time, fewer miracles need to occur for that to actually be able to work, and is a way to enhance the FedCM capabilities. And the second one is a bit more reliant on the concept of there being a federation operator that the browsers know about, which from an academic perspective, and I don't mean like academic community, but just in an ideal world, the offloading trust model, is that's solid. It truly is a trust but verify, and has all parties interacting with all other parties, and it's glorious, and it's a huge heavy lift, and a lot of miracles need to occur for that, I think, to happen. But still, there may be something there that we can learn from and use to update FedCM itself. In the meantime, we're focused a bit more on the earlier one, the IDP SP storage API, to see, can we do something to signal to the browser that this is a valid exchange without interrupting the protocols themselves, because what FedCM does right now does actually interrupt the SAML protocols, the OpenID Connect protocols, in a way that's causing them to break a little bit, which isn't acceptable. If you want lots of gory details, or if you want your developers to look at those proposals to see what they all mean, go to those URLs. I can't describe them in great detail. I am not a developer and I cannot play one on TV. So all this is great, but there's still a couple of really big areas of concern that the people working on FedCM, the people working in the Federated Identity Community Group, they're looking at certain problems and we're going, I don't know what to do with that. The biggest one, and I would say possibly the blocker to all others, is the sheer scale of IDPs out there. It is not unusual for a service provider to need to present thousands of IDPs to a user. Maybe not all at once. Maybe that's the hidden behind a nice little smart search box. But still, there are thousands of IDPs that they need to deal with, and FedCM doesn't know what to do with that. This comes back to in their head when they're first starting, they're thinking the consumer web, where how many IDPs are really relevant? 5, 7, 10. We'll get generous and say 10. Facebook, Google, Twitter at the time, and other than that, it just wasn't that big a number. We have such a big number that they don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to present that to the user. It's a problem. There are other parts that will, when we can solve for scale, we'll still have a handful of other things that we have to worry about. One of the next really big ones is browsers think in terms of origin. They think in terms of what domain did this come from? And that's as granular as it gets. SAML and OpenID Connect protocols think of endpoints. They think of a very specific, it's not just coming from elsevier.com, it's coming from sp.elsevier.com/something, something, something. It's a full URI that identifies exactly what is the endpoint, and the browsers don't know what to do with that. Kind of related to that are the issues of proxies. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with proxies, but particularly in the research side of the world, proxies are very, very common, where a user will go to CERN, the Hadron Collider people, and say, I want to actually log in. I want to be able to access services. And so it looks like they're coming into an IDP, but behind the IDP are a lot of other endpoints that are going to be communicated with. So depending on what side of the proxy it's on, it may look like an identity provider, or it may look like a service provider. It's kind of both at the same time. And this broke the browser vendors' brains, because they never really thought about just how many chains there are in terms of getting a user finally to where they need to go in an authenticated and authorized manner. Couple of the other problems. So as I mentioned, FedCM as it is written right now does interfere with the protocols on a level that has nothing to do with third-party cookies themselves, and that will need to be addressed. They don't know what to think about, they have it in their heads of, okay, so when a user logs in, then we can somehow record that the user is logged in, and when they go to other sites, we don't have to bootstrap again because that will be an IDP on the short list. Well, yes, but sessions can be very, very short-lived. They can be only 15 minutes long. How often is the browser actually going to be able to refresh that? And why would the browser refresh that? That's outside of that protocol. Also, what if the user is doing a purely anonymous authentication, where it doesn't give any details about the user, just that they authenticated? What does the browser actually record? They don't know. They don't know how to deal with that either. The people who were at the hackathon were all SAML people. And SAML and OpenID Connect are very, have a lot of similar concepts, but they don't exactly behave the same. They are, at the end of the day, different protocols. Particularly when it comes to how do they indicate whether they trust one entity over another. SAML has federations. OpenID mostly does not. I mean, theoretically it does, in that they are working on a federated protocol for OpenID Connect, but I think it's only deployed in Italy right now. So, ongoing issues and concerns. One of the things that we can all do to really help is, more than anything, the browser vendors need identity providers and service providers, or SPs or RPs, again, depends on what protocol you're using, to actually test their canary work and provide feedback. Do not expect that just because the browser vendors, or at least Apple and Google in particular, have identity providers, so why do they need us? Because those are two really different teams. The people working on Chrome have nothing to do with the people working for the Google IDP. It's a very, very big pair of organizations over there, and it would be better for us to do the testing in our own environments. It's always better to offer yes ands. It's always better to say, okay, let's see what you're trying to do. Have you considered trying to do the following? Just saying, no, this isn't going to work, while it may be true, is not actually helpful. So the hackathon in that respect was a wild success. We got the browser vendors' attention as a community willing to put in the work to help them solve a problem. And that puts us far ahead of many of the other use cases out there for governments, for enterprise, because we're like, we know how to do open source code. We know how to iterate quickly. This is what we do for a living with our code base all the time. It's how shibboleth actually happens. It's how simple SAML PHP happens. It's literally the core of how trust and identity have worked in research and education for decades. So we know what to do to help, and that made us shine in a big way. The issue of proxies, that may not be a use case you're concerned about, but I know it is a very big use case for other areas of research and education, and that's going to be really interesting. We're at a loss at the moment for what to do with that. So any imaginative ideas will be appreciated if you have any thoughts on how we might be able to address that problem. All right, where are we going to keep having these conversations? Well, the Internet Identity Workshop is coming up in 2 weeks' time. That's in Mountain View, California. That is an open space conference, which basically means the agenda is set when you get there. Some of us may play hooky for half a day, I think Wednesday morning and Thursday afternoon, to go over to the Microsoft offices so that we can have some focused time with the people who were at the hackathon, who will also be at IIW, to draw on whiteboards and figure things out. In addition, there's going to be a side meeting at the next TNC conference. TNC is one of the bigger research and education conferences in the world, put on by GÉANT. GÉANT is a consortium of research and education federations in Europe, but the conference is definitely global in scale. Your mission, if you choose to accept it, is figuring out how to get to Albania. Want to learn more? We've got you covered on that. The Federated Identity Community Group is a fine place to lurk, join, see what's going on. I'm the chair of that group, so it is, of course, my favorite. And the nice thing about community groups in the W3C is it doesn't cost anything to join. You do have to accept an IP, basically an IP agreement. But if your company will let you do that, then there you go. It would be great to have you. Another group to follow with interest is the Private Advertising Technology Community Group. If you think about it, we can easily blame the advertisers for the problems we're in today, because they're the ones that are tracking people more than anybody else. Well, so they have their own community group to try and figure out what to do when the tools and technologies that they use are going away. So it might be interesting just to watch in that space to figure out what are they coming up with that might be of interest to your companies. There is a privacy community group. This group has been around longer than any of the others on this list. And they're definitely an interesting group to watch. That's where there's work going on, they call it navigation-based tracking, which is another term for link decoration. The interesting thing about that group is that they're very, very focused on privacy. Privacy is the consideration. It is practically the sole consideration. Nothing is more important than privacy. Whereas for like the federated identity community group, privacy is very important, but it's not the only thing we're trying to accomplish. We recognize that there may need to be some levels of balance in there. What they are, we don't know yet, but we know that the world is bigger than that, just the one lens of privacy. And last but not least, there's the Refed's browser changes in Federation group. So this is a very, very focused on the research and education lens for all of this. The work is, of course, bigger. The work is global in scope. The work looks at what FedID CG needs to deal with it's not just the research and education case, it's also the enterprise case. It's also the consumer case. It's also the government case. It's also the healthcare case. It doesn't matter what the case is. We have to deal with it if they're using federated identity. The Refeds group is much more tightly scoped than that. And it's looking at, okay, but for us and our needs in the research and education and community, what do we do? How do we engage? How do we test? How do we help? So that's a fine and dandy group to join as well. Also none of these groups actually cost anything to join. And with that, I am happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Heather. I'm sure there are questions. Feel free to put them in the chat, raise your hand, or just unmute and raise your question in speaking.
I know it's a lot of information to absorb, and the biggest challenge I think people have had has been when trying to turn around to their executives and say, okay, this is something we have to watch. And the executives say, well, for how long? How long do I have to pour resources into this thing? When is it going to happen? What are our deadlines? To which the answer is, we don't know. Executives don't like that answer.
Yeah,
Yes.
I see you've put on your camera and unmuted yourself, so go for it.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So Ken Ferris, Taylor Francis, met you before at GetFTR quite a few years ago now, I think. So primarily, I'm the director of cybersecurity for Taylor Francis. So I defend our sites whenever they're attacked. One of the problems we have is trying to tell the good people apart from the bad people. And even when we do that, we want to protect the access for the good people while stopping the bad people. That's a big challenge, particularly when people are behind proxy servers. Which of the groups that you've mentioned would you advise me to track for my interests?
I think I would send you to actually do a different one, and that's called WebAppSec. Hang on, let me type that. WebAppSec. Oops, let me actually spell it right. Which stands for the Web Application Security Group. I think there's a lot of work going on there that might be of interest to you.
Yeah, I'll look at that. Is there an addendum I might be able to use to make decisions on traffic in the future that will come out of this?
Not how you think of it, no. Not what will come out of this is an API that will let the browsers help make a decision about what comes out of this, right? The browsers will be able to say, do we want to allow this login to continue to happen? But that's happening at a different layer than where I think you work.
Yeah. Okay, Heather, enjoy the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so will the recently launched browser plugins be affected? I can't answer that because I don't know what they do. I don't know what those browser plugins do from EBSCO and libkey and whatnot. But what would be useful is to turn around and ask the vendors who put those together, are you aware of what's going on here? And if not, why not? And if you are, how are your plugins taking this effort into account?
Do you want to elaborate on your question, Rob, to speak about the functionalities that these browser plugins are offering?
I think he got it.
Okay.
DM'd me.
All right. Any other questions? Opening it up. I'm sure people must still. I see Rob is coming on camera. Rob, did you want to elaborate on your question?
Yeah, it really is a question and a concern that the number of browser plugins that continue to come up in the marketplace are jumping ahead of maybe the library infrastructure and grabbing students and researchers on the web, and they put in a plugin, and all of a sudden they're able to find full text content, whether it's open or not. And libraries, I think, might feel a little vulnerable because it's not where the research is starting. And it's a real culture change for libraries. The EBSCO Passport plugin was just announced in the last 24 hours. So it would be interesting to follow up with them. It's trying to meet the user where they're starting the research, but if you look overall, there's at least 5 now browser plugins for students to consider. It's getting to be a very crowded space, I think, adding complexity overall to how students start their research. So just a theme and a concern overall.
It would not surprise me in the slightest tiny bit if vendors start coming up with dedicated applications, mobile apps, for users that bypass browsers entirely. One of the ways that Teams can bypass browsers is download the Teams app and just go that way. So that I do not know that to be the direction, but that direction would not surprise me.
Yeah, it's a good point to explore and evaluate. Once again, from the student's perspective, imagine enrolling in college and getting 3 pages of all the direct apps that you have to download and install to have your student experience. So trying to sort that out.
Oh yeah, I thought that I'd be done with term papers by now, having graduated college 30 years ago. But I just published what's essentially a very long term paper, and I had to do all of this research for it. And if there had been a solid just app to go to, I would have found that very, very compelling. Google Scholar was fine, but something a little bit better would have made my 125 hours worth of work a little bit better.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for that, the help understanding that.
Sure.
Looking around, I think there is a comment or a question from Zacharias.
Oh, so his point about being an anti-pattern, absolutely. Oh, I don't think that going to the app by app model is necessarily good, but looking at it from the vendor's point of view, it's an awful lot easier when you control the environment end to end.
And how do we prevent that from happening? Do we offer a better solution?
I don't know that you can prevent that kind of thing. If that's where they decide to put their efforts, as opposed to putting their efforts into figuring out how to make Federation work properly, I mean, the only thing you can do is to continue to try and make the Federation experience better and easier on all fronts, right? Right. This session has been talking about the browser-based logins, which, you know, is fine, it's good, but it doesn't talk about, well, how do service providers feel about joining a federation? How many identity providers, how many colleges and universities out there find joining federations really, really hard? So the identity provider discovery component, which Seamless Access specializes in, is, I would say, necessary but not sufficient in terms of, if you want to make things so much better that dedicated applications are a waste of time and money, then you have to make federation easier from the very, very start of make it easy for universities to join a federation, make service providers easy to join a federation, and to do it the right way so that things will actually work. And we're not there.
While we have you on screen, Zacharias, can I invite you maybe to say a few words about how, for everybody here, Zacharias is the product manager of Seamless Access, how Seamless Access is engaging in this space, and what are some of the questions that are top of mind for the people at Seamless Access in having these interactions with the browser vendors?
Sure. What we did at the hackathon was look at different models where the goals of the browsers could be fulfilled while at the same time not breaking our patterns, like Heather mentioned, with our protocols and such. And the proposals as they exist, they align quite well with Seamless Access. So we don't see any reason that the use of Seamless Access would no longer be a viable option. But we're tracking that progress and making prototypes of Seamless Access that will eventually invite our community and the integrators to test to see if it works in their environments. So we're tracking that and making prototypes, and we're also engaging to provide our big knowledge base of how the user interface and user experience in the federated world best looks like, and to bring that knowledge into the work with the FedCM. So that's our focus right now.
Perfect, thank you for that. All right, looking around to see if there are any other burning questions or comments or reflections. Going once, going twice. If not, then let me thank Heather one more time. Fantastic presentation, very insightful. I've learned a lot again. And thank everybody for joining us today. We'll make this the recording available and to be continued. Thank you all for your time today.
Thanks, everybody.